Hello and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to use the Python request module. Now, the request module allows you to send HTTP requests using Python. This is an easy to use interface that makes it easy to make GET and POST requests. So in order to demonstrate how easy it is to get started with requests, I will be using the vantage free stock API to get the prior day closing price of the stock of my choosing. You can easily add additional features to this project, such as headline news about the stock, a link to the brokerage website to buy or sell shares, or you can elect to have SMS. So if you're interested in seeing how easy it is to capture API data using the request module, keep watching this video. Okay, so the first thing we want to do in order to make our API requests is to sign up for a free account with vantage. It's free and it's easy to sign up. All you need to do is fill out these 3 questions, and once you fill out these 3 questions, you'll click on Get Free API, and from there you'll have your free API key that you will need in order to successfully make your request. Once we have our free API key, the next thing we want to do is click on the documentation link at the top of the window. On the left-hand side, you're going to see a list of various APIs that you can access. In today's video, we're going to be using the daily adjusted API. From there, you will be redirected to the section that explains how we utilize this particular API. So the cool thing about vantage and most APIs, if you scroll within the documentation, it'll actually list how to utilize the API in the coding language of your choice. For me, in today's video, we're going to be using Python, and as we can see here, we actually have these steps in order to our API request to this endpoint. So with this information, we now have enough to get started. So the next thing we want to do is open our text editor. I'm using Visual Studio Code, but you're welcome to use any text editor of your choice. From there, we want to create a file in order to type out our code. I created a simple file called main.py. From there, we want to launch the terminal. And the very first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we have the request module installed. And the way that we install the module is by typing pip install request, and we press enter. So now that we have the request module installed, the next thing that we want to do is we want to set up variables. Now, we could certainly follow the documentation and make the request the endpoint using our URL, but the preferred method is to utilize variables. That way you can leverage the endpoint in various functions within your program. Okay, so now that we have our text editor and main.py file set up, the first thing that we want to do is we want to bring in variables in order to make our request. And now, in order to verify the variables needed to make our request, we can take a look at the documentation, and we want to head to the section where it has API parameters. And the parameters that we're going to need for this API request are called function, symbol, and API key. These are the 3 that are required. Now that we have those variables identified, the first one that we want to have set up is for our API key. I have my API key entered into my file. Obviously, this is something that you want to share with the world, so make sure that you keep that API key protected. The next thing we want to bring in is the symbol. So in order to identify the symbol, we're going to create a variable named stock symbol. And for today's video, I'm going to be using PSEC. Okay, so now that we have our API key and we also have the stock symbol, the next thing that we want to identify is the endpoint for our API, and what we'll name this variable is stock endpoint. And the stock endpoint is the URL that we're going to need in order to build out the URL for the API request. And we can capture the stock endpoint here within the documentation, URL listed here. Okay, so now that we have our stock endpoint added to the additional variables that we've created, the next thing we want to do is create our parameters. So here, if we go back to the request documentation, we can see that we need to pass in parameters in order to make our API request. And instead of storing that information directly in the URL, I've decided to store it within a dictionary so that it can be accessed in multiple sections within the application. So in order to identify the parameters, they're going to be listed here. The first parameter that we're going to need is name function. The second parameter we're going to need is symbol. And here we're going to add in the variable stock symbol. And the last parameter we're going to need is API key. And here we're going to add in our API key. Now that we have the variable set up, we can go ahead and make our request. We see that we're going to need to include the endpoint and our parameter. So now that we've added in the stock endpoint and the parameters, you see that we're getting this particular line and it's mentioning that request is not defined. So if we click on that line and what it will do is it will import the request module into our file, and now we have access to use requests. So now that we're making a request to our endpoint and parameters, the next thing we want to do is print out the data. So in order to print out the data, we want to convert this data into JSON. And then once we have the data variable created, so we just want to print it out by running our program. And as we can see, we get back this large response from the data. So this tells us that our request is working successfully. We want to work with this JSON data, which is basically a dictionary for us in Python. And we want to identify a section of this data that we want to return. And what we're going to be looking for is the time series daily. We see we have 417 listed here. It will give us the opening, the high. We want to be able to work with this data. And we'll do so with this syntax. If we press the run code button. So if we take a look at our terminal, we'll see that we're getting the response back by day. So here we have 417, 414, 413, and so on. We see that we're getting the response back by day in the format of a dictionary. So the next thing we want to do is loop through that dictionary data using the for method. And if you're unfamiliar with this particular syntax, this is built into Python, allowing you to loop through the keys and values, and it's going to return items. So in order to see the results from this newly created variable data_list, we'll adjust the print method here at the bottom. See that it is returning the actual day. So in order to see the prior day, all we need to do is access the first item. Those are identified numerically, starting with the index of 0. So we'll add that to our data list and we'll run the code. And if we look in our terminal, we are accessing the first item within our dictionary, which is yesterday's opening, high, low, and closing stock price. So from here, if you want it, you can build a small application where you can select the dates and you can see the performance of your stock. You can also elect to have SMS messaging sent of the closing and opening of the prior day's stock. That way you don't have to log into your brokerage account and you can always get that notification. So there you have it. As you can see, it is very simple to work with the request library in Python. If you found this video valuable, please feel free to leave me a like. If you have any other suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. And if you'd like to support and follow my journey as I become a software engineer, feel free to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.